I repeat constantly, I'm studying French. I want to say constamment.
Love that. I love that you're studying French.
It's going to take me like 10 years.
My favorite things.
One of the things that happens is always say, Ta-Nehisi, it's very nice that you're at the Atlantic.
8-tech cybernetic serum injector.
And why is this happening at other places? Why is the press away? Why is it? And what happens is there's kind of this notion of a conspiracy theory or whatever they want to keep us out. In fact,
identification required.
It's just especially at the magazines, you have to take an internship. Those internships until relatively recently were not paid. You had to have certain backers. There's only a certain sort of person who can live in New York City for a year, summer, whatever, and not, take a paycheck. The New York Times, I think this is less so now, but somebody was just talking to me about this yesterday, used to specifically draw basically from the Ivy League. So there's a whole connection to the angle. The pathways in are just so narrow. And if you were like me, I got lucky, but if you're like me, if you're a kid who grew up in West Baltimore, went to public school, went to college, God forbid you dropped out of college like I did, you tend not to even know where to begin, where to start, where to go. The reason why I think this has a relation to your book is because what you end up is a group of people who may well know each other from college. If they don't know each other from college, they come from a particular social class.
Yep.
They have that sort of commonality there. If you're doing White House reporting, they're around each other constantly. And this is the funnel through which we get our politics. And I just, you talk about social distance. I mean, I have a lot of, social closeness to the president, to the people who are around the president, to powerful people, to the full class of billionaires that you're talking about.
I
have very little social intimacy to God forbid poor people. I mean, working people, whatever. And you're not going to live around. I mean, I don't live there, so.
Right. No, that's spot on. I think it's pernicious, and I think it.
So the very people, the very people who would be a check on this,
right,
are in fact part of it, are involved in it.
Yeah, particularly in our political culture, yes. Although the one thing I would say to push back on that is, I do think, and this is going to sound maybe naively romantic, but I do think that reporting done correctly is one of the few ways to attack head-on the problem of social distance. Because a genuinely good reporter really does listen first. And I think the thing that I love most about being a reporter, the thing I love most about being a reporter now, although I don't get to do as much reporting as I used to, would be that I could go into worlds that I didn't have any social connection to and just go there and ask people what's going on. And try to, as faithfully as possible, tease out what was going on. And so good reporting is actually one of the ways that we can bridge it, or at least we can try to deal with this problem.
Right.
But the specific class origins of the American press is a huge...
Wait, I just want to stop you there, though. But what happens if we end up listening to the same people over years, over and over again?
Then you get what we got. Then you get what we got. And I think that's... I mean, and what I mean by what we got was Iraq reporting, housing bubble reporting. And there's this capture problem. There's this cognitive capture problem, which is that, if you spend all your time reporting on people on Wall Street, like, they're not idiots, the people on Wall Street. I mean, some of them are, actually. Some of them really are. But a lot of them aren't. They're extremely smart people, and if you just spend all your time talking to them, like, it just chips away. They start to sound persuasive. Like, there are... The question is, who are you close to and who are you distant from?
Right. One of the things I want to ask you about, I'm going to tell a personal story, and I should not tell this, but I'm going to. I'm going to write about this one day. It has to do with money. My money. Tax money. If you decide, and I hope some of you in this room will decide, if you decide that you want to be a writer of any sort, no matter what you come from, you will find that movement across tax brackets through a series of years is not an uncommon experience. So if you're like me, you will have years where you made $1,000 that year. That's just what happened. The dream is that you'll practice it well and maybe you make a stable living and things get better, things get better. I have been lucky enough that things got a little better. They got better enough that I looked at my taxes differently. Now, I didn't, say I don't want to pay taxes. But what it did do was it put into relief in a way that it couldn't have, let's say 10 years ago, what Mitt Romney's tax rate actually was and what he really was doing. It really, in a way that I just couldn't understand on those years I made, 1,000, 2,000, even 10,000, 20. Right. I just couldn't understand it until I saw it. And I think one of the most interesting things is the people who are most likely to be critical are actually like you. Actually come from, the institutions of maritime. They come from it. They are of the elite. Malcolm X has this speech, which I love Malcolm X, but I always think it's dead wrong. He tries to contrast the field slave and the house slave. He didn't say slave, he used a totally different word that we won't use here at MIT.
You can Google it.
Right, you can Google it. Right. But the notion is that somehow if you are in the field, if you are down, you somehow have, you are better able to critique what it is. And so I guess I want to challenge.
Right, this is interesting, right? That this is exactly the same insight, the kind of distance.
Yes, except proximity allows you to see things too.
Right.
That maybe you couldn't see at distance either.
Well, so that's,
like I always tell people, the Haitian Revolution, right? Most successful, I think the only successful slave rebellion, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, was led by Toussaint. Well-treated, slave, very, very educated. Nat Turner, when they interviewed, they say, I was very well-treated. Denmark Vesey plotted this giant slave rebellion in South Carolina. It was free African Americans. So these are not people who were totally in the.
Well, so I mean, there's two things I'd say here. One is there's a chapter in the book which is about how we get the knowledge we get, and I do think that I talk about these kind of three shortcuts, heuristics that we use to figure out what we know. And one of them is proximity. That's one of our rules of thumb, which is you want to hear it from someone as close to the source as possible. Right? So it's like, and one of the crushing and devastating betrayals of the failed decade, as I call it in the book, is that proved to be a pretty crappy way to learn about the world. Because a lot of the people who were closest to the manufacturing of the Death Star machine that was the securitization machinery of Wall Street were the most blind to its consequences. And the people at the periphery were the ones who saw it first. And it's also true about the people who had, quote, the best access to reporting on intelligence in Iraq. Right? The people with the closest, the proximity. But then this question about a radicalized sector that is very close to the people at the top, I think is very right on, and it's something I write in the book and also have taken some flack for, is the idea that in some ways the most radicalized class in America over the last 10 years is the upper middle class. And not because they have it worse, because they don't. But because the experience of deindustrialization and poverty that was the norm in the 80s and 90s, although sort of lifted a little bit in the 90s, meant that, and this is things people have told me in the west side of Chicago or in San Antonio or in New Orleans, that the last decade was bad, but so were the 90s and so were the 80s, right?
Radio on.
The people I think who feel the last decade as a kind of radical disjuncture,
copy you loud and clear,
and discontinuity and betrayal the most are the people who do have a relative amount of privilege, who had faith in the system that is now repaying them with crisis. And I do think that is a predicate for radicalization.
Yeah, I think also the other thing is you can't discount, I think the notion that, and this is, coming out of this whole idea of meritocracy. If you were rich, you necessarily work hard. It's just true, you necessarily work hard. And then all sorts of moral judgments come with that. And if you have no direct access to rich people, I would argue that it's very easy to buy that yourself. And to, internalize that, even as you may be critiquing it, I can speak only for myself, I'll say that once you get close to it, it is shocking how human people actually are.
Absolutely. And one of the things that's really fascinating about our elite and the meritocratic elite that's different from other elites is that because the story of elite formation is a story of overcoming and a story of social mobility, that people are then, as almost a kind of ritual of entrance into the elite, to construct for themselves their own story of overcoming, their own story of mobility, even when manifestly ridiculous. So the best example of this is Mitt Romney. who got up at a presidential debate, and it was a primary debate, not in the general, and basically said, look, you know, I could have inherited the car company, but I struck out on my own. These are his terms, struck out on his own. He came here to Cambridge, where he went to Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School. And then Ann Romney gave this notorious interview to the Boston Globe. Actually, I think it wasn't during this campaign, although it resurfaced, where she talked about their years in BYU and the hardship they faced, in which she talks about stapling squares of carpet sample to the floor, and when times got tough, having to sell some of Mitt Romney's inherited stock to make ends meet.
Identification required.
Now, that's odd. Yeah, that's ridiculous. You can laugh. That's ridiculous, but it's very genuinely felt. And I think one of the things that is one of the kind of psychopathologies I think that the current meritocratic elite produces is that because we have what I call the book fractal inequality, which is everyone always has someone just above them who's making more money or has more status, and that goes on like a kind of MC Escher drawing ever upward.
And what you're saying by like the factor actually increases too.
Exactly.
The actually increases.
But basically, the relationship, like the 1% has the same relationship to the top 10th of 1% as the top 10th of 1% has to the top 100th of 1%, which is that the distribution skews and skews and skews like that.
Right.
Well, from your perspective, like that. and so, what that does is, you never feel. You always feel under siege. You never feel, there is no space even for something that would look like noblesse oblige. Because even though you are an overlord, you are convinced you are a scrappy underdog. And this is true of people, like, if you ever read a Roger Ailes profile, this is one of the most powerful people in America. And he genuinely thinks that, like, he is under siege. That there's some elites somewhere out there. Like, if anyone is an elite, it's Roger Ailes.
Right. So, two questions, and then I think we should open it up, right? Is that how time is moving? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
You have time.
Okay. All right. I'm just gonna filibuster. And I have my memoir here, which I will begin reading.
You guys should all read it. It's great.
Hustle my own book here. So one of the things I wonder is how much of this is about what the American idea is of being rich, of making it, and I think. Again, speaking from my own experience, looking at how it's projected out to us, it is the absence of work, which actually never, I don't think, really happens. You know, if I may give some credit, it was a profile in New Yorker, maybe about 2 months ago, the billionaires were going after Obama. And the guy was basically illustrating the pathology you just outlined. Now, just to take his defense, he's waking up at like 5 in the morning,
right.
You know, he's at the office all out. He's working.
Right.
And his idea is, I work hard.
Right.
I work hard, you know. And I wonder if that has, you know, something to do with the inability to see himself as having done it.
Totally. I mean,
like, he's not royalty in his mind. I'm not, you know, Prince Charles or
no, this is true.
From.
And this partly this has to do with a really interesting political economic fact, which is about the nature of the 1% moving from essentially a rentier class to a wage-earning class, right? So, like, the people at hedge funds who are in the 1%, you know, that's their wage. I mean, they call it carried interest, but it's not really. That's their wage. If they pay 15% on it, but they're not. A lot of them are not the idle rich as we would think of them, right? Because, and I think Americans, our relationship to work and working hard, I think, is a very under-interrogated thing. You know, it's really fascinating to go back and read political and economic theorists in the late 19th century around the Industrial Revolution. Keynes wrote about this as recently as the 30s, and the Jetsons. Go back and watch the Jetsons. There was a broad consensus for a long period in intellectual history that the problem humans would face is what to do with all their leisure time. Because obviously the surplus of capitalism and technology would produce everything we needed without having to work. And in the Jetsons, they work like 7 hours a week. George works like 7 hours a week. Of course, there's no, like, feminist revolution in the future of the Jetsons either. Obviously, it's very... But And Marx, you know, Marx has this very beautiful passage in I think it's in Capital when he writes about, you know, he writes about the sort of his ideal being essentially, in a weird way, the kind of abolition of work and the full flourishing of humanity, in which every man could be a fisher in the morning and a poet in the afternoon, as his soul so desires. That you would work a little, and then you'd maybe do like your watercolors, and you would, and it's funny that seems ridiculous to us now. That was actually the chief aspiration for so much of the intellectual history of the development of capitalism, was that the thing that this was all driving towards was freedom from work. And now we just realize that's ridiculous, and in fact, we're just all working more. And there are other places where, in Europe, for instance, they have taken much more of a leisure. They have made the choice, essentially, to take that surplus in leisure. And I don't want to, like, I mean, obviously, like, I work very hard, and I think there's great dignity in working hard. But, you know, this economist said to me once something that has haunted me ever since, where he said, time is the only resource they're never making any more of.
That's right.
And he said you could always, not always, but he said you can borrow money and you can't borrow time.
Did the world just slow
and,
down
you know,
around me?
I mean, not to get too morbid here, but like this is all we got, at least from my particular worldview. I'm sure people in the audience don't think that. But from where I sit, like, this is what we have. And, you know, I think everyone deserves the right to both fulfilling work that genuinely has both dignity, that pays them a good wage, but also, like, dignity and wages are only part of it, because happiness comes from doing something that brings the fulfillment that there is some connection between effort and reward, that you are seen as a full person, that your ideas and inputs are a manifestation in some sense of who you are. And now I'm sounding preposterously utopian, but I think that everyone deserves it.
You know who does watercolor? You know what?
I know two people that do watercolor.
Okay, so I'm going to see if you can guess what I'm thinking about. Go ahead.
Paul Bremer.
Paul Bremer does watercolor.
Has a website.
Paul Bremer said, I'm done. I worked on doing watercolors.
And now George W. Bush is doing that.
Are you serious?
I'll resist the kind of out, down spot joke.
Right. You know, I think also, I just want to go back to that Mitt Romney story you told, because I think one of the things that people do not understand, this is very, very hard to get across to people, is even if Mitt had no money at all, even if Mitt really did strike out on his own, got no help, had to sell all of his stock options, as an African American, when they study race, they always want to compare income. So they say this white family over here is making
Access
this,
code
this black
identified.
family is making over this, the
Welcome,
black family still
Lieutenant
lacks. Clearly
Morgan
there's
J.
something
Webster. A
There's
waiting
no
call
sense
has been
of
registered
social
with your
network.
personal ID.
Mitt
I
Romney
will play the
knows
call from
people
Netcom.
that
Gordon?
Mitchell Jenkins does not.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
He has connections.
Right.
Sorry.
That, you know, this
You
guy
must be
over here, it
mistaken.
doesn't matter. Like, you
Apparently,
can strip the
I'm
make, you can
Lieutenant
take
Morgan J.
everything from them.
Webster.
Right.
He's going to be able
Stop
to call
messing
somebody
around,
else.
Gordon.
Another person
That's
over
just
here
a
is not. Now,
disguise.
often,
I need your
how do
body.
we put that
You
in
planted your
conflict with
mind
the
into
dollar? There's no
Lieutenant
sense of
Webster's
that at all.
body through the network.
No, there's zero
Bullshit.
sense of that, and
That
the
technology
reason
does
there's zero
not
sense of that
exist.
is because we have this
You're
kind of
wrong,
formalistic
Gordon.
vision
It exists.
of equality of
Biomedical
opportunity.
future tech did. It's
This
just a
formalistic vision is the level
prototype, but
playing
you are living
field,
proof that
right?
it works.
And the level playing
But you
field just
should know
writes
that.
out and erases so
Unless-
much.
Oh,
And it
shit.
erases, it
Your
just doesn't,
conscience
there
may
is
be
no
leaking
conversation
through the
about
network.
privilege in mainstream
You're
American
remembering
discourse,
things.
right? There's
Mission?
Congress, like,
Yourself?
wrong. It's like shaming or like to even bring it up.
because
What mission are you
all we will,
talking
what we will
about?
talk about
Who
is
am
the
I?
inverse, which is disadvantage.
Right.
In
Right.
theory.
Right.
Which is less
Right.
dangerous.
Right.
So we will
Although
talk
this is
about
no longer the
disadvantaged youth.
Currently,
We will
you're
talk about
only
poor
a kid
schools and
without
poor kids,
memory
and isn't it
who
so
screwed
poor
up
that they're
their
so
mission.
poor?
Right.
It's a bit harsh.
And what can we
Seems that
do?
you've just written
How
me
can
off.
we bust the
That
teachers
means you're
union
not
so that they
coming
can
for
do better on their
Right.
tests?
Right.
You know how it goes.
I'm letting my politics show there a little bit.
Right.
It's a complicated
Allegedly,
issue, I will
Well,
grant.
just, I mean, again, to show how this over,
So that
you
I
know,
could get
overlaps
away
with
with
race. One of the
some
things I
sort of
always
serum?
think about is
Well,
throughout the
if that was the
campaign,
case, it
Obama,
went
show us
wrong.
your
I
birth
must have gotten
certificate, I show you your
cornered,
birth
stuck
certificate.
here.
Show me your
Anyway,
college
what kind of
grade,
serum is
show me
this?
this, show me
Yeah.
that. And it would have
Anything
went
more
on
specific?
and on
Did you
and
get the
on, no
serum?
doubt.
What do you even care? You've already put me on the casualty
Mitt
list.
Romney is from a neighborhood
Don't be so
in
childish.
Detroit
It doesn't
called
suit
Palmer
you.
Woods. I
The
had
serum was your
the pleasure
mission.
of reporting
If
on
you
Palmer
have
Woods
it,
in
of
Detroit.
course we
He
will
was born
rescue
there
you.
in,
All
I
right.
think,
Now let's cut to the
1927.
chase. Who are
Mitt
you?
Romney was
How are
born
you going to
into
get me out of
segregation.
here?
if you look
My
at the
name's
deeds on the
not
houses from
important.
Palmer Woods from
But
that
call me
period, they
Lisa.
say
The base
no
has a
black
hammer.
people here.
Maybe
No,
we
it
can
might
send
be
a
no
grasshopper in there to pick you up.
definitely no
Can you
black
get there?
people here who do not
be
work
on
here. They
it,
made an
Lisa.
exemption for
Then
Latino
get going. And
who
do
do
not
not
worry
work
about
here.
anything.
He was
We will
born
even
into
help
a
you
right
regain your
to
memory.
not have to compete.
Once you get to the
Into a
hangar,
broad
log on to
affirmative
Netcom
action
on the
across the
network.
city, across the
The
society, on
password is
every level.
Panther.
Nobody looks at
And
his
we'll
run
send
and
a
says,
copter for you.
well, show us how you got it.
Right.
You know, no sort of inverse critique of that at all. One last question that I want to open it up for the audience. I want to challenge you on something that I think about all the time. Well, no, I'm not going to do that. You know what I want to do? This is your audience. This is the elite. We got a lot of MIT kids, especially to the front. What do you have to say to them? What's their response to that?
That's a great question. This sounds... I'm doing that thing where I'm critiquing what I'm going to say before I say it, so maybe I'll just say it. I'm like writing the critique of it before I say it. You have an obligation, if you have privilege, to do something that is going to make the world more just and equitable. You have a moral obligation to do that. I believe that with every fiber of my being, and I think part of the insidiousness of this kind of meritocratic rat race is you convince yourself that you're just another striver. And like, you got to get on your grind and get on your hustle so you can win this kind of race.